Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. In today's episode, I'm talking to Bill Cotter and Phil Lawler about the largest civil disobedience movement in American history, Operation Rescue. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the Catholic Culture Podcast. No doubt many of you are new to the show, being that this is only the second episode, so welcome. I've actually got two interviews for you today. The first is with a true hero of the pro-life movement, Bill Cotter, who is the head of Operation Rescue Boston. And the second is Phil Lawler, who, of course, many of you will know from CatholicCulture.org and Catholic World News. Phil wrote a book in 1992 called Operation Rescue, A Challenge to the Nation's Conscience, which I read several weeks ago and was fascinated by and disturbed and challenged by. I had heard of Operation Rescue. I knew that it was some form of pro-life civil disobedience, but I didn't know how huge the movement had become for a few years there in the late 80s and early 90s, really at the beginning of its existence, where it was many times the size of the American civil rights movement, even, with tens of thousands of people being arrested between 1988 and 1992 when Phil wrote his book. So I was talking to Phil about this, and he put me in touch with Bill Cotter, who he had worked with back in the day during his involvement with Operation Rescue. What I didn't know before actually interviewing Bill was that he spent 19 months in prison for the pro-life cause. So as I say, a real hero of the movement. So the bulk of this episode is an interview with Bill Cotter, and then at the end I have a shorter interview with Phil Lawler about his own involvement and his thoughts on the movement since then, and about his book, which I link to in the show notes page. That'll be catholicculture.org/episode 2. I'll also link to some other things there, such as some video footage of police brutality against Operation Rescue people. And also, of course, there will be the timestamps for people who want to skip around to various topics in the episode. Before we start, real quick, I just want to apologize for some of the sound quality in this episode. I'm still figuring out how to record people under various conditions, and some of it is a little bit uneven in the first portion, but some of these problems were resolved by the time I got to recording the second part of the program, so that one is a little more consistent in its sound quality. All right, so here is Bill Cotter. Enjoy the interview. Bill Cotter, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
I was hoping, if you don't mind, we could start with just a description of what a typical rescue would look like. People are showing up in front of an abortion clinic. What exactly is going on? What are they doing?
Well, by rescue, I assume you're talking about, as we did it in the what we now call the old days of the 1980s and 90s.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it would be, as you say, an abortion clinic would be a location, one or more, on a given day, and you would have advanced knowledge of what the typical schedule was for the day there. And prior to the rescue, you would have had assembled people for one or more meetings to instruct them in what to expect in terms of police response, legal consequences, how to behave during the rescue. We always stressed to them that it was something that we felt was an act of faith, an act of repentance in a way for the country's indulgence in abortion and other sins that contribute to it and spring from it. And that we were going out there in that spirit of repentance and with the commitment to be nonviolent in word and deed, with respect especially to clinic personnel, police, or anybody else. The rescue had defined leadership, who would give instructions as to where people would go and when they would move and so forth. And then, after a number of these meetings, it would typically be a prayer rally, maybe the night before or several days before, give people final instruction, a little, encouragement. We'd also raise some funds. And then on the morning of the rescue, we typically would meet very early for prayer of some kind. Typically it'd be like a mass for the Catholics, prayer gathering for the Protestants, maybe like say 5 a.m. or something. Afterwards, we would get into and proceed to the location. And those who were committed to risking arrest would assemble, at the door or doors. As it turns out, sometimes they have front and back entrances, and they would sit down and occupy the entryway, or in some cases, would just actually, go right into the building, particularly if we had, the advantage of having no advance notice. We didn't announce the rescue publicly beforehand. Sometimes we go into the building because it might be an office building where there were several businesses, and we're really interested in interfering with one of them, name of the one that had children being killed. So people would proceed to their places, sit down, stand up or whatever, lock arms, and just remain there. And the idea being that as long as we're here occupying the entry and egress, then children are not going to be killed. And depending on how many people you have, if you have, a couple hundred people, you're going to be there probably quite a while, especially if the police are not, ready and waiting for you. Then they have to assemble and come around and, put up the police horses and barricades and so forth, and then try to clear a path and all of that. And so all that takes time. And with a rescue, the name of the game is, in terms of the tactics, is delay. The longer you delay, the more likely is that there'll be no abortions done there that day. And while the blockade is going on, then you have other people on the site who are in prayer, and then other people who are on the lookout as sidewalk counselors going up and down the sidewalk trying to talk to the people who are approaching as customers of the abortionist. So that's, more or less the mechanics of how a rescue would go.
What kind of delay tactics would you use if the police were getting involved and trying to pull people away?
Well, the biggest, delay tactic, two biggest ones, as I mentioned, are, the advantage of surprise, and then secondly, having large numbers of people. And thirdly would be one where you had a cooperative police department. Some were more cooperative than others. I remember one we went to where the officer in charge would come down and ask the rescue leader, well, how much time do you want? Well, 3 hours, okay. So, they would hem and haw and they'd leave us there until, 3 hours later and they'd start to pull us out. Others were very, very quick. Some other tactic you could use would be, for example, locking arms together or using kryptonite locks, for example. People would lock themselves to each other or lock themselves to some obstacle that may be in or near the clinic, or if they're going to take people away, say in a vehicle like a school bus, and some people would sometimes go and lock themselves to the drive shaft. And so the bus couldn't move, therefore the whole removal operation on the part of the police would be stalled.
So it sounds like there were a lot of sort of ingenious but clearly peaceful, not really possible to misinterpret this as anything other than peaceful tactics to delay basically the police getting rid of the blockade. And I remember reading in Phil Lawler's book, people would be instructed to go limp if a police officer was trying to drag you away, so they would have to work a lot harder. And people would even do things like chained a group of people would chain their necks together with bike locks so that the only way for the police to take them away would either be to risk serious injury, which they wouldn't want to do, hopefully, or they would have to get some specialized equipment to break through the lock, things like that.
Right. Yeah. Typically locks were used when you had fewer numbers of people. Like if you had, 150 people, 200 people or something, then, generally speaking, we didn't have people locked up except for, like sometimes they'd lock to the bus or something. But when you only have 4 or 5, maybe 10 people or something, then it doesn't take police too long if they're energetic to, even if you're going limp and everything, to get you out of the way and, clear the entry. So in that case, we found that locks were really added to the time of removal. But yes, it was, and even the police admitted. I remember when we were having a civil trial over in Norfolk area court, where the opposition was seeking an injunction to have rescues governed by the Mass Civil Rights Act, which that was a law put into effect back in the time when they had race riots over the school busing situation, and it was designed to punish, violence against people who were in favor or, protesting the busing or, in favor of busing or whatever. But there was violence, associated with all that. So that law was instituted for that. So what our opposition argued and succeeded at was saying that when people blockade abortion clinics, they are violating violating the civil rights of women and therefore come under the criminal penalties of this law. And so they were under the law, they were enjoined from carrying on further blockades.
Now, is that basically what? Obviously, the Operation Rescue movement still exists in some form, but is that kind of legal strategy what kept the rescues from going on as they had been in the late 80s and early 90s?
Yeah, that, and just, even without that, I think you would have run into deterioration in numbers because you only had so many people, and most of the people were kind of average type people in terms of not having infinite amount of time available to do weekends in jail or 3 months in jail or something. So after the certain amount of arrests and things, penalties will start to build up. So you're going to run into a certain decay because rescue, in the bigger picture nationally, kind of, exploded on the scene in the end of '87 into the summer of '88, and it came as sort of like the Big Bang. It came all at once, and most of the people you ever saw in rescue came during that year, and then a few others were added as you went along, and as publicity happened, like with the Democrat convention in Atlanta in 1988. So people were added over that summer. But after that, it was mostly the same people, with a few handful added here and there. And that same group of people was exponentially declining. So you kind of peaked through 88, 89, and then after 89, you did see, injunctions imposed and so forth. And then the face bill, I think, I'm not sure when that came, 90, 91, something around there. So you did see, as was expected by some, and correctly so, that things would just sort of decay in terms of the body of people you had to draw on to keep putting people in front of a door. So it became kind of unfeasible to do it, because number one, the penalties, and number two, you just don't have the quantity necessary to really make it go of it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you were mentioning a lot of these people are just regular folks. There is a small core of committed members in Operation Rescue who could risk, because they were doing it full time, going to jail for longer times. Maybe they didn't have a family to support, or maybe their family was okay with it. But these are not the type of people who are, typically speaking, involved in activism of various kinds, showing up at protests, and it's interesting as far as this is very different from what you would call a protest movement or an activist movement, and in particular, these rescues are not demonstrations. They have a specific goal, a concrete goal that they're trying to achieve on that day in that place, which is simply to prevent abortions, and that really sets it apart from other movements.
Yeah, no, I think very much so. And I think, the left, for example, has a whole, spectrum of protests that they're involved with on a variety of issues. And people on the left tend to be collectivists, and people more conservative, and religious people, tend not to be involved with protests, and especially ones where you'd be risking arrest, because it kind of smacks a bit of rebellion, and also smacks of causes that they're not really sympathetic with. So there's, I think, an inherent resistance that has to be overcome before somebody would get involved with something like Operation Rescue. And then you don't have that collectivist reflex there on the part of people either. So there was a number of headwinds that you faced, but still in the aggregate, a lot of people got involved. It drew a lot of publicity over 2 to 3 years. I'm sure lives were saved, and we're still, in some ways, still experiencing the momentum that we had back then, in the fact that we have people still on the sidewalk several days a week. We're out of the clinic, still rescuing children in terms of babies actually being saved.
Right.
Happened by someone blocking a door, but
that's right.
Happens by what ultimately has to happen anyways. Is that the mother has to change her mind.
That's right. Yeah.
The blockade just becomes a little extra forced pause in her plans, but ultimately she has to change her mind, because if she's adamant about the abortion, then the door is blocked on Saturday. Well, she can come back Wednesday.
Right. I'd like to talk about the numbers, because in Phil's book, he says that in between 1988 and 1990, about 41,000 rescuers had been jailed, and ultimately there were more than 50,000 arrests by the time he wrote his book, which is, I forget what year, maybe 92 or 93. And he notes that that's 6 times as many people being arrested as during the entire 1960s civil rights movement, which is itself staggering, and it makes you ask, although, we already kind of know the answer, why don't people know about this? But at least, why don't more Catholics know about this?
Well, like you say, I guess you know the answer. And aside from media bias and a media agenda where they promote and they report certain things, in order to promote them, they take polls in order to promote some aspect of the poll, what the poll is supposedly showing, as opposed to just reporting news. And much of their bias is manifested in what they don't report. So it doesn't get reported. It's not happening, or if it does get reported, it's only a brief mention, and then it's on, as opposed to something they want to promote gets pounded over and over and over and over and over again. The advertising world will tell you, to sell a product, the person has to see an ad 6 times or something before they move to look at buying your car or whatever. And so if something gets seriously attenuated by a paucity of coverage, and then also with the idea, much as you see now, I think now it's really, out of the mask is really off now. You see anything of the nature of a conservative person or cause is automatically branded as something racist and sexist, homophobic, and just anti anything good. And that was the same thing with Rescue. It was racist, sexist, anti-gay, born again bigots go away. And so that the label, the taint of violence was stuck on us, even as the police admitted in that trial there where we were, the other side was seeking the injunction in Middlesex Superior Court. Just about every policeman that took the stand said, no, it was very peaceful demonstrations, very peaceful. Yes, one of the most peaceful you've ever seen. Yes, yes. But the media would never really give you credit for that. They would just label you as, various types of, anti-woman and anti-choice and, violent, kind of oppose their religion, et cetera, et cetera. And, frankly, I think you see now even more, there's very definitely a divide within Catholic Church, within its hierarchy, within its clergy. There are those people, we have people, priests, who are distinguished by being called, ironically, he's pro-life, a pro-life priest. Well, that should be a redundancy.
Right.
Like saying a Christian priest, Christian Catholic. And then you have others who are they may not come out and say they're pro-abortion. They may not be pro-abortion, but they are certainly not willing to do any favors for the pro-life movement. They will, avoid mentioning events, don't put things in their bulletin. It never comes up in a homily. It's as if the issue was just off the table. Unfortunate, but that's a big factor. And, we now have, for example, in our archdiocese, I think a very great headwind we face is that 40 Days for Life gets no support from the archdiocese. They've said, no, we're just not going to support that. And so it's hard to make headway with pastors. We do have several priests and churches that are supporting us, but when you have a chain of command among the priesthood and within a diocese, and if the commander isn't giving the order and giving the direction, then it tends to diminish the effect tremendously.
Well, this sort of ties together all the different areas of society that Operation Rescue faced either opposition or indifference from. And you mentioned charges of violence against Operation Rescue by the media, but another thing was that there was violence against Operation Rescue that was basically ignored. And there were a number of instances of serious police brutality, particularly in Los Angeles and in West Hartford, Connecticut. And I was wondering, did you ever see or experience any kind of police brutality, or what can you tell us about, how often that sort of thing occurred?
I mean, overall, how often, it's hard to say. I'd say, but yes, I mean, I've seen it and experienced it. Nothing, I hadn't seen anything personally where it was, serious injuries or broken arms, but I'd seen people, thrown around, and, the West Hartford Rescue was a part of that. And, police were pretty rough there and twisting arms and so forth and throwing people around. I remember Dr. Stanton in Boston. I didn't see this, but he was arrested downtown at one of the clinics down by the Boston Common, and he was then crippled in his around 80, or maybe plus or minus a few years, and he had suffered from polio as a young man and was quite fragile and not at all opposing. But he was thrown, I think, into an elevator at the police station after he was arrested. They took him off of the prisoner transport van, and then they threw somebody else on top of him. I think it cracked a rib of his. Could have killed him had the rib gone into his lung or something. So he followed it up And the press conference about it, police badge number was given to the police, and then they said, "Oh, gee, that badge is not assigned to anybody." So there's been very few, if any, that I'm aware of, any successful civil actions against abusive police in terms of rescuers. I know certain West Hartford, and I think they dismissed, and it did come to trial, and I think they ended up with like 3 defendants or something, and other things got dismissed, and there was little or no consequence for all the years and years of effort, effort that went into it, collecting data and transcripts, affidavits and everything. John Platty and others worked very, very, very hard, but in the end, it all fizzled out.
Yeah, that seems to be pretty typical, unfortunately. There's very little accountability.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting that this was not just a couple of police who lost their tempers at some intransigent rescuers, at least in West Hartford, Connecticut. This was how they were trained to deal with. I don't know if it was with Operation Rescue people in particular, but maybe just with protesters or people who were blocking a space. They had this term pain compliance. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't think it's peculiar to West Hartford. That pain compliance is anytime a policeman has to move somebody who's unwilling to move, then while twisting, an arm or something, move, then twist you more until you move. The more pain we apply, then the more you're willing to comply with the instructions to voluntarily move. And of course, rescuers were trying to delay and not get up and voluntarily walk away, but be carried away. And that's, most police would carry people away, but others did apply. Had one apply pain compliance to me down in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, when I was getting off the bus. I didn't voluntarily leave, so, we twisted the arm and the campaign made you comply.
I'd just like to share a little bit from Phil Lawler's book, which is called Operation Rescue, A Challenge to the Nation's Conscience, which sort of ties together this with the media perspective. And he says, in July 1990, when over 200 pro-life activists were jailed in West Hartford, Connecticut, the New York Times completely ignored their arrest. Times readers only learned about the massive arrests several days later in a story about crowding in the area's prisons. Consider that editorial judgment. The overcrowding was worthy of coverage, yet the massive arrests which precipitated that crowding were not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you also had sort of hostility from not all, but certain judges. You had instances of judicial misconduct where there were huge fines applied to rescuers and disproportionate sentences that were clearly intended either to cripple them financially or teach them a lesson in some way. You had the injunction against blockades, and that brings you into it because in Phil's book, he mentions that you were sentenced to a year in prison and you were not tried, as is the custom in the jurisdiction where the alleged crime was committed. So can you tell us about your experience? Did you end up actually having to serve that year in jail?
Well, it was actually 2.5 years in jail was the sentence, of which I served 19 months. But I mentioned before the civil injunction, that criminal injunction rather, that the authorities had sought in Middlesex District Court, and it was the one that enjoined blockades, saying that they were a violation of the Mass Civil Rights Act and were subject to the criminal penalties within that statute. And the criminal penalty in that statute for a nonviolent act, which they claimed constituted extortion, threats, intimidation, was up to 2.5 years in House of Correction. So we'd done a couple of rescues subsequent to that injunction, got arrested, and then there was an indictment, and we were arrested in Norfolk County, which is Brookline, and but the indictment was sought in the I can't think of the name of the county. Middlesex County. The indictment was sought in Middlesex County, so we ended up being tried in Middlesex County, even though I'm not sure if it's a statute or it's the Mass Constitution says that one is supposed to be tried in the county where the offense takes place. So when I talked to my lawyers about this, they said, well, I think some interpret that as, when you violate an injunction, that's the offense, and since the injunction originated in Middlesex, you get tried in Middlesex. So anyway, we did get tried in Middlesex and tried there, sentenced there to the maximum penalty, 2.5 years, although I could have got 5 years because there were 2 counts, but I got a concurrent sentence instead of a consecutive sentence. So I got 2.5 years concurrent. And then at that time, they had a little different practice than they do now regarding so-called good time. If you had statutory good time, which means comes right off the top, as soon as you walk in the door. And then after that, you can earn good time by education, recovery meetings, and work. So in the end, knocked down the 30-month sentence to a 19-month sentence. So I went in from November 91 to June of 93.
So you spent the full 19 months in jail?
Right.
Wow. And did you have a family at that time?
No, I've had that luxury, if you will, of not having a family to support. So.
Wow. Well, that's still really, I'm not sure, I'm not sure what to say about that. That's first of all an amazing sacrifice on your part. But how were you treated in prison? Were you treated any differently for political reasons or anything like that?
I have to say, overall, I was treated very well, and I spent the first month up in Middlesex House of Correction. And that was in Billerica, and then I moved down to the Worcester House of Correction, which is, in Worcester. Well, it was in Worcester. Actually, it was in West Boylston, but closer to my parents, and it was a better prison to be in anyway, a better house of correction to be in, and the administration there was sympathetic and so I was well treated and got good quarters and everything. And the time actually went by, rather quickly, strangely enough.
Wow. Well, nonetheless, that still can't have been easy.
Well, yeah, I was always glad to get out. Yeah, that's for sure.
Now, others were not treated so well, relatively speaking. I remember reading about Joan Andrews, who was another of the heroes of Operation Rescue, and she was put in jail for, I think, 2 years for unplugging an abortion machine. And she spent other times in jail as well. And she spent, I think, I can't remember how many exact months she was put in isolation, but she was even put in isolation at one point because she had sort of a general non-compliance policy. She was, I guess, one of the more radical spirits in that sense. And she wasn't allowed to go to mass or anything. So, there's been some, I guess all of the treatment has been harsh. I mean, it's harsh that you were put in prison, and certainly for the ridiculous amount of time that you were, but some have even been treated pretty harshly in prison. There were reports of abuse by prison guards and things like that, unfortunately. How did your local Catholic leaders in the diocese respond at that time? I know that there's been a variety of reactions from bishops and other Christian leaders. Some were very supportive, even to the point of Bishop Austin Vaughn famously going to jail himself and taking part in rescues. But some bishops were unsupportive. They thought it was not a good look, or they felt that it was breaking the law and there was no justification for that. So how did you fare in Boston with that in the late 80s and early 90s?
Well, the bishop at that time was the ordinary was Cardinal Law, and there were several auxiliaries under him, and he didn't really come out against rescue. Although I remember he wrote one editorial in the Pilot saying that he thought that the trespassing law was a just law. We were bound to obey just laws and so forth. But he misunderstood that. But when I was first sentenced to jail, he did come to visit me, and then
oh, that's great.
The second time. And he also went up to Framingham Women's Prison when one of our rescuers was there, although he didn't go there with the intention of visiting her. He was just there to, visit the prison. But then he coincidentally ran into this Mary Kelleher and met with her, that he was there and he was surprised to see her or whatever, and told him what she'd been for and all that. And he wrote an editorial about it, and he was very empathetic with her and, spoke with admiration. So in that sense it was good. And then in Worcester, we had Catholic chaplain, a priest. Not many jails do have. He was a full-time chaplain. So we had Sunday Mass every week and Holy Day Masses and stuff. So that was very unusual. I remember up in Billerica, all we had was a deacon who came in on Sundays, and he'd pray with us and stuff. And then, like I said, there was a number of priests who were involved with rescue and so forth who were, still very supportive and come to visit me and all that, and other people who were in jail around that time. So mixed, but still had, thankfully, some support.
Going back to the overall history of Operation Rescue, I'm sort of curious as to why it started when it did, because abortion, of course, had been legal for quite some time. Operation Rescue would have maybe started, in 1987 or 88 or something like that. So why did people start taking this approach to the abortion issue at that time?
Well, there had been rescues prior to that. There were even some in Boston in the 1970s, 2 or 3 or 4 something, I don't know. And then I remember my first rescue was in, let's see, 1985, I think, in New Haven, Connecticut. And then another one the week after in Brookline. You know, there was just like 5 or 10 of us or something got arrested. I think in Brookline it was like 12 got arrested. And then there was 2 pretty active rescue communities at that time. One was in Philadelphia, one was in St. Louis. Joan Andrews came from was the St. Louis one. Well, she'd been actually active out there, I should say. She was actually, born in New Jersey. But, it was going on. And in St. Louis, they'd be doing rescues there every week, but it was like, 2 or 3, 5 people or something. And they had a very, very sympathetic judge who, just be like catch and release type of thing, okay, not guilty, see you later. So they were able to carry on. In Philadelphia, people actually went to jail for some time, like 2 weeks, 30 days, 60 days, whatever. They didn't do rescues as frequently there, but it was still a relatively active thing. But, what really kicked it off was Randall Terry. And in 1980, I think probably he was 86, 87, he was starting to think about it. And then in 1987, what was it, 87? I think it was 86. We're down it was over the Thanksgiving weekend. We went down to Pensacola, Florida, when Joan Andrews was in jail, and would have a protest area, and then protest the judge, and so forth. And then we had a rally there, I remember, out on the common with a gazebo and all that. And then one night, as we were down there, we had kind of a dinner and a meeting in a restaurant, with the various leaders from different people, different pro-life groups around the country. And this, Randall Terry was there, and he was just saying how, we need to kind of step up the game here, because we just keep going on with, protests and rescues, and we just get picked off, with injunctions or whatever. We need to bring just absolutely massive numbers to the street, somewhat like the anti-war movement did, civil rights movement, and just make it so unwieldy that they either have to stop doing abortions or just leave us there blocking the clinic. So he had this idea of bringing 2,000 people to New York City, 1,000 locals, 1,000 from outside, and just have a week of rescues, be the media capital of the world, and bring, gobs of attention and so forth and so on. So that plan got underway. He started to talk about it, in different gatherings and whatnot, and then had a trial run in 1987 over Thanksgiving weekend in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. 300 people got arrested, biggest ever. Clinic closed for the day, big success. And then it was on to the spring of 1988 in May. I think it was early May, and had 4 out of 5 days in New York City, various clinics, and everyone had between 200 and 500 people or something. And clinics shut down. Police, it was all arranged with the police beforehand, how we would conduct ourselves and what they would do, and they would carry us off in the buses out to some processing center, get a citation, back later, and, kind of in and out, and that was it. And then later on, you had a court date or something, and it was a, suspended sentence or whatever, fine or something. So it did kick things off, but there was very little publicity about it.
Right.
There was stuff with, Jerry Falwell covered it, Pat Robertson and stuff like that. But as far as the secular media, it was kind of a blackout. But
Right.
where it did get some coverage was finally in 88 Atlanta, because it was a prolonged event for the Democrat convention, before the convention, during and after. And there's rescues going on, frequently down there. And finally, it cracked through the secular media. And that's kind of when, rescue exploded across the country. The different groups sprung up, here, there, and everywhere. But so it went, as most things pro-life do, went far and wide, but not very deep,
Right.
20 people here, 50 people there, 100 people there, all across the country, but not too many places had, overwhelming number of people. Like, you really could feel like, this is a real grassroots, community-wide effort type of thing.
So were you traveling around taking part in these different things? Like, were you at Atlanta and New York and things like that?
Atlanta, no. Atlanta, I was down in, when Atlanta was going on, I was down in, they had 1 or 2 rescues down in Pensacola.
Okay.
Tallahassee, I think it was. But anyway, it was Florida. And I remember Joe Foreman came down from Atlanta, trying to recruit some of us to go up to Atlanta. But I personally didn't get involved in Atlanta. Some people did in Boston. Most of what I did, subsequent to all that was in Boston, although I did take part in, some rescues here and there. Was involved in a rescue in St. Louis, Wichita, when they had the series of rescues out there. I think that was in the summer of 90 or 91, maybe. And they were out there for about a week or something. And some others in New York, Florida. And remember when the Pope came in 19, that was before Operation Rescue per se came, I think in 87, John Paul II. So we would get involved.
This was the We Will Stand Up thing?
Yeah. I was involved with the rescue in South Carolina.
So to clarify for our listeners, that was an attempt in 1987 to shut down the abortion industry in every single city that Pope John Paul II visited. And they managed to do it in Miami and a few other cities, and had partial success elsewhere, right?
Right.
What about Wichita? Can you tell us about that, the Summer of Mercy?
Well, it went on for, I'm not sure, a few weeks or something. It was focused on the Dr. Tiller's clinic, especially given that he was a proud late-term abortionist. And, it was almost a daily thing out there. And I don't remember that much about it in detail, except that there was, a lot of people arrested, a lot of pro-lifers in attendance, and that there seemed to be a lot of public support. I remember just being one time at a Burger King, and somebody had a pro-life T-shirt on, and one of the other customers asked, what's that about, and told them, and she said, "Oh, wow, great, yeah, And so around here, of course, the default position is you're some kind of terrorist or a freak or something.
Right, yeah.
Undesirable. And but out there was a lot of receptivity, and it went on for quite some time, and I don't think I got arrested there, even though I was part of the rescues, but for whatever reason, maybe they weren't going quickly enough, or the clinic closed for the day or something. I don't know what it was.
But a lot of people were arrested, and they would go to jail for a weekend and get out and go right back to the blockade.
Yeah, that's about how it worked.
So we already talked about basically how Operation Rescue in the form that it had then sort of ended up fizzling out a bit. What has Operation Rescue been doing since? What form has it taken in the decades since then?
Well, it takes in large part the same form in that most of our activity in 1989 was sidewalk counseling, and, that was our daily bread, if you will, and it still is, several days or most every day we're out in front of a clinic trying to, persuade women not to have their abortions, and then the difference being that back then, once a month, twice a month, we would have a blockade, and now we don't have that, but we still are out trying to, and with some success, actually rescuing children scheduled to be killed by abortion. And then other First Amendment protected activities, protests, and so forth. We're much smaller now than we were then. The mailing list is smaller, the prayer vigil is smaller. Remember, they used to have monthly rosary vigils that would have 200 or 300, 400 people at them. Now, maybe 20 people or 10 people. And then, but with 40 Days for Life, we've gotten a boost of people back, especially some of the Hispanic people come out because we have Hispanic, rosary vigils. We get 20 or 30 people for that. We just had our annual Stations of the Cross for Good Friday. That drew about 65 people, half decent. It used to be a few hundred people, though. It used to notch down when all the clinics were, well, not all the clinics, but when there was a plurality of abortion mills in Brookline, we used to have a procession, down Beacon Street, first one, the second one, the third one, with several stations at each one, and then praying the Chaplet of Divine Mercy along the way. And the police escort, will get us across the different intersections. It was quite an event. Now it's, a relative handful of people. Well, 65 is more than a handful, but still goes on, and we've still maintained the sidewalk counseling presence and added a counselor here and there. But you can see, as you can with just about every pro-life event, the demographic winter setting in. That when I started this, I was in my 30s, and then time goes by, and people aren't going in. You don't have many people coming in, if any, coming in, except for a couple of Franciscans, some of us. You don't see the people in the 30s and 40s going in the ranks to become sidewalk counselors or prayer supporters, at least with any regularity. You have someone here or there. You might have a college student or two for a semester, and then they're gone, and then it might be a year or two before you see another college student. Then several years before we had any regular sidewalk counselors from college. I think maybe it's like 10 years since we've seen college students with any regularity being sidewalk counselors. So it's not very promising as far far as the future of pro-life work goes. There's a big turnout at the March for Life, where they, parochial schools get rounded up, and your Catholic colleges, the ones that are still Catholic, come out in big numbers. But you look at any rank and file meeting, not just sidewalk counseling, but Mass Citizens for Life March or Mass Citizens for Life Convention, Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund banquet, which is coming up. It's mostly old people, 50 and up.
It's interesting because I've heard so many times that the younger generation is getting more and more pro-life. So how does that fit in?
To really find out how it fits in, the pollster would have to ask the question, are you pro-life or pro-choice? I'm pro-life. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Because I've had people, that I've talked to at the abortion clinic say, well, I'm against abortion, but this case, she's got to do it. So what do you mean by pro-life? Just like when somebody says, I believe in God. Well, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by believe in him? So I'm very skeptical of, these polls, because that's really the only indexes that I'm aware of that indicates, we're becoming more pro-life, because, marriage rates are down, birth rates are down, church attendance is down. The people who are, the Mass State House, for example, back in the 80s, used to be overwhelmingly pro-life. Now they're overwhelmingly pro-abortion. And almost any politician you can think of who's changed his position has gone one way only, pro-life to pro-choice. So, where is this big wave? There were people who believe polls in November of 2016, and by that poll, Hillary should have been president, but thank God she isn't.
Right.
So I'm skeptical, that the poll has drifted up a few points, whatever, and just like the definition of sex and chastity and virtue, those have changed. Certain president used to say what he was doing wasn't really sex,
Right.
And I think certain people, the definition of pregnancy has changed. So the pills that actually cause abortions, and well, no, it's not abortion because she wasn't pregnant.
Right.
It's only conception, but they didn't have implantation, so it's not abortion. So verbal engineering has been quite substantial. And then with the way our schools and colleges are so thoroughly and viciously indoctrinating students, it's hard to believe that they're escaping that filter and having the majority of them come out pro-life.
Well, certainly not in a thoroughgoing sense of that word. They might have a greater distaste for abortion for one reason or another, but not in a sort of consistent moral sense.
Yeah, now how are you going to vote based on your alleged opinion?
There's a lot of debate to be had over the effectiveness of political approaches to the abortion issue at this time. But I feel like a lot of people of my generation are increasingly cynical, maybe, certainly apathetic, and just don't think that we're going to get anywhere that way. So let's just focus on different issues. And there's some truth to that, but that can also be sort of an easy out. And I think the fundamental challenge of the legacy of Operation Rescue, especially in those early years, is that this social situation we live in is not normal. And even as a thoroughly pro-life Catholic, it's easy to just get used to the fact of abortion and countless millions of children being killed every year. And Operation Rescue, learning about its history, makes me ask myself, why shouldn't I be in jail right now? It's like the Henry David Thoreau idea, which I think very much inspired or at least resonated with the early Operation Rescue movement, which is that in an unjust society, the best place for a just man is in prison. So I'd like to ask, why shouldn't I be in jail right now?
Why are you in jail? Why aren't you? Why shouldn't you? I don't know. I mean, I don't see jail as a goal. I think, Thomas More struggled with, I think said something to the effect that, we'll obey the king if we can. And, if there's a way to obey his directive, let's do it. But, there wasn't. So he ended up being persecuted. But I think you look at the early church, certainly it was replete with martyrs, St. Paul being one of them. And yet there were, occasions where, St. Paul went over the wall and, Jesus himself, avoided certain areas because of the hostility there. So I think there's something to be said for doing what you can in a way that takes account of the realities of the situation. I mean, I think empirically, the most effective thing that can save children right now, given that laws aren't going to ban abortion right now, and even overturning Roe v. Wade would only affect a few states, probably. The most effective thing, that we found is, the Pregnancy Crisis Center. That's the thing that saves the most babies. You have to have an asterisk beside that because I think, education is very important. If you can get into a venue to actually speak to kids at soon enough age, like in a Catholic school, that probably saves, untold numbers of children because, the children become properly formed and never go to the abortion clinic, which is, the ideal, of course. But of those who are pregnant and are actually steered away from an impending or, a possible abortion that may have been pondered with some degree of seriousness, then it's, the Crisis Pregnancy Center. And, augmenting that is, of course, the sidewalk counselor. But the pregnancy center has a whole lot more leverage because once the woman gets in there, it's a better atmosphere which to address the woman. The woman's going to be more receptive. Plus you have oftentimes an ultrasound to resort to, and that's, extremely persuasive. Whereas on the sidewalk, you're mostly talking to people who have made up their mind, and so therefore you get very little receptiveness. So you have Planned Parenthood, say the Boston Planned Parenthood does, let's say 7,000 abortions in a year, and we turn away 25 people of those. And we say, okay, it was, an average year, but it's, extremely small percentage. Now that maybe others, get turned away because they cancel their appointment or they drive by and, just keep going or whatever. So let's say it's 30 or 35 or even 50, it's still a tiny percentage. But on the other hand, what can you do? How can you, so once, that's the tragedy of abortion and the stain of it, it affects, because once somebody has an abortion, typically they, go through years and years of justifying it in their own mind. It will affect their children, as their children grow up and she gets pregnant, the daughter gets pregnant, and what are you going to do? And it becomes, the more acceptable it becomes, the more people who've had abortions, then the more of inertia of rest sets in, and it becomes less shocking. It becomes something that people are going to be less prone to try to dissuade their family members from and so forth. So, the bigger trouble. And then, you have the spin-offs from it, the less overall respect for life there is, the more secularized the country becomes, the more God is excluded from public forums and even from your Catholic forums. Like that student down at Providence College, who was harassed in his dorm room for just stating, well, marriage is between a man and a woman, and you think he had advertised for the Klan or something. And so it becomes, more and more people then will become incentivized to be silent about, these so-called hot button issues. Certainly the silence is the norm in the pulpit. So, I would say, just offhand to people, do what you can, but don't seek strategically to get yourself in jail. I mean, you might end up there anyway. And then in the interim, I think, as this secular wave, the cultural jihad of Islamization also works its way in, along with the overwhelming secularized enculturation. We may find ourselves in jail just for answering yes to the question, are you a Christian?
Well, it seems like behind all of these particular things we can do, whether it's sidewalk counseling or working at a crisis pregnancy centers, prayer is the most necessary thing because, a few people sidewalk counseling is not going to convert the culture, which is of course what we need. It's doing a good thing, but if people aren't praying, then even the number of people doing sidewalk counseling or running crisis pregnancy centers is going to diminish, or they're going to be co-opted somehow into something else. So I think praying the rosary, praying the Divine Mercy Chaplet is really essential. If there's any hope that we're going to somehow climb out of this hole.
Yeah, definitely it is essential. And even if you knew we were not going to climb out of the hole, it's still essential.
That's right.
But as I sometimes point out to people, Jesus and the 12 apostles lived in Jerusalem, and yet 40 years later was burned to the ground, so.
Yeah.
It wasn't for lack of sanctity on their part, but
that's right.
The cultural wave, went one way, and the consequences set in. So, but on the other hand, the Christians escaped, so.
No country is permanent. So as you say, it's entirely possible that the culture could just collapse in on itself totally, or something else could happen. Some external force could demolish it. But while we're here, we have to pray and do everything we can. So on that note, how can people learn more about Operation Rescue and possibly get involved?
Well, depends where they live, of course. I mean, Operation Rescue Boston, we have a website, orboston.org. The National Operation Rescue with Troy Newman and company is, I think, at operationrescue.org, if I'm not mistaken. Or you can just Google Operation Rescue. And that's, two ways. And there's, many other pro-life groups and pro-life efforts around. And there've been many effective things. I mean, I don't think anybody should just look at the macrocosm and decide, well, we can't change the whole society, or we can't get a human life amendment or whatever, because all these incremental efforts are very important in the sense that there's been a lot of good effects that have come from many, many state laws and restrictions that have set in over the last 20 years or whatever, especially like in the last 5 or 10 years, I think. A lot of restrictions. Most states, for example, don't fund abortion out of the state money. Massachusetts is an exception to that. We do, and it's very important. You've seen a number of Planned Parenthoods closed.
So, Bill, what would you point to as some signs of hope in the pro-life movement currently on the ground?
Well, I think, the signs of hope. I mean, obviously, we have eschatological hope, the supernatural virtue of hope, which, is something we hope in God, and that, God is, exercising his providence. And that doesn't mean that we should be optimistic about our particular circumstances or outcomes in the short term or whatever, but that his kingdom is going to triumph. So we have that sense of optimism. I'm not optimistic about how things are going to go with America, but nevertheless, there is definitely an active and inspiring and very important remnant of people who are at work in the church, in pro-life ministry in a variety of ways, both politically, legislatively, and there's been much accomplished on the state levels where restrictions have been put in place. It hasn't overturned the apple cart, but it's whittled away. Lives have been saved, just as in various hostile environments, souls are saved here and there. One soul, and I read that the Jesuit martyrs in North America went, I think it was something like 11 years before their first baptism. And, Noah put the 8 people in the ark, and a very important thing, although he was a tiny minority in his time. But we have many, many pro-life people across the country. There are many people who are devoted to praying their rosaries, being faithful, young couples who married and having children, which is something that's gone out of favor. But nevertheless, there are certainly a sizable core, if you will, of people who are exercising that extremely important pro-life work. We have numerous Catholic schools that have sprung up, Catholic colleges, and, a remnant once again, but it's from the remnants that the kingdom of God is built on, So when and to what extent these remnants are going to mature, we don't know. We read in the Catechism says that it's an error to assume that, the world is going to get better and better and better and finally culminate in the second coming. I think the expectation is going to get worse and worse at some point or other. There's going to be uphill high points in the interim, and we hope we're going to see one of those high points. But there's a lot of cultural corruption out there, and it seems like, every time there's an advance by the dark side, whether it's abortion, same-sex marriage, cohabitation, transgenderism, the gay rights movement, or whatever, it seems like we never really succeed in overturning that. We just maybe bargain for a few concessions or a few, limitations on things, but we're still seeing the advance one step through all of the cultural institutions. So we have a discouraging set of circumstances, but if for people of faith, we can't be discouraged. We can't, because we have to ultimately have that courage and that encouragement which comes from God within, we have as Christians. So we really have to be conscientious about our spiritual lives, and history shows that the only successful resistance ultimately to any of these movements is a strong church. When the church was strong, Islam was turned back in Europe. Now if the church is weak, Islam is prevailing in Europe. The church had some success against communism, but here in America we see materialism on the advance, but the church still has many vital pockets. So I think there's fairly evenly divided here, perhaps. In any case, we still have a lot of vitality, so we're not by any means at the point of no return. So I think we have to look, and rejoice in these small victories and push for more, pray for more, but ultimately we're going to leave the result to God.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. And I want to thank you, Bill Cotter, first of all, for your service to the pro-life movement and the church, and specifically for coming on the Catholic Culture podcast today. Thanks a lot. Okay, that was Bill Cotter, head of Operation Rescue Boston. And here is my interview with Phil Lawler. Hi, Phil. Thanks for coming on the Catholic Culture podcast.
My pleasure.
Could you tell us where you were sort of in your life, the overall context of the time that you got involved with Operation Rescue and how you first became aware of it?
Sure. I was editing the Pilot, which is the Archdiocesan newspaper in Boston, and I became aware of this group that was doing protests, as I thought of them at the time, at abortion clinics. And there was a whole lot of discussion about that within the Archdiocese and the Chancery. I thought the discussion was a little bit odd because everybody was wondering how should we meaning the Archdiocese, control these people? And I was wondering, why do you need to control them? So that was my first sort of head-scratching moment. And then I went to cover a rescue as a reporter. And I was very interested. I was certainly sympathetic. I thought of myself as pro-life. And I thought these people were probably extremists. So I went to see what was happening, and I wanted to do a report that would be reasonably objective. And when I saw what was happening, I found it difficult to be objective because I said, what these people are doing is right. It makes sense. I saw no reason to criticize them. And in fact, I said I shouldn't be reporting, I should be joining them. So the next rescue in Boston, I was on the other side.
What was your observation about the type of people who were involved with Operation Rescue on the ground?
It was sort of interesting. My first impression was that these were movement people, movement with a big M. I'm thinking about the group that called itself the Movement in the 70s when I was in college. Very different sort of issues, but the same sort of people who were really dedicated to what they were doing and were going from place to place doing it. My second impression was that they were extremely prayerful people and that they were logical in carrying out what they saw as a clear moral imperative. That is, as many people were saying, if you knew that the house next door was burning and there was a baby inside, you wouldn't hesitate to run inside and rescue the baby. So why don't you try to rescue these babies if you really believe they are babies?
Right.
If that's not just rhetoric. And I found that pretty convincing. And so I became more and more sympathetic. And, before each rescue, there would be a prayer service, usually in the evening, Thursday or Friday evening before a Saturday rescue. And they were terrific. They were wonderful experiences of prayer.
You were involved, of course, in Operation Rescue as a writer, and I'm thinking, of course, mainly of your book, which inspired the interview I just did with Bill Cotter. But as far as your involvement in the rescues themselves, would you say that your experience was more close to your average rescuer than to the experience of, say, someone like Bill Cotter?
Oh, well, I'm certainly not in the same category with Bill Cotter. He's was one of the veterans and one of the movement and a leader and a hero as far as I'm concerned, and he paid a very heavy price with a lot of jail time for his courage. My experience wasn't really ordinary, though, in the sense that while Bill was in jail, I was more or less the public voice of Operation Rescue in Boston.
Oh, okay. So
I did have a sort of high profile for a while, and I was the object of a lot of public attacks.
Were you arrested? I seem to remember that you were in your book.
I was arrested a few times.
So how much time did you end up having to spend in jail, and what was that experience like?
The funny thing is I was arrested 3 times, but only once was I actually taken to jail. I mean, 3 times I was told you're under arrest. But I only went to jail 1 time, and as a matter of fact, I only stayed there for a matter of hours because, family issues. I bailed myself out.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you didn't have to spend 19 months. I was sort of shocked by that when I talked to Bill. I didn't realize that he had spent that long, but he didn't really complain about it, you know?
Bill's he's not a complaining person, and he made the sacrifice willingly, but it is sort of stunning that he spent that amount of time for a misdemeanor. That was a formative moment for me because it helped to shape my attitude towards, well, frankly, the death penalty. When I realized that if anybody in Massachusetts was going to get the death penalty, it was probably Bill, just because of the level of public hostility at the time.
So tell us a little bit more about your involvement as the public face of Operation Rescue for a time and what you did in the media for Operation Rescue.
Well, I was asked to stand by during rescues and just talk to reporters. And the interesting thing is that most reporters didn't really want to talk to me. So it was a little bit of a sales job and not a very successful one. The thing that I found most striking there was when reporters did talk to me, they would ask me, if they were asking questions, they would say, "What do you think we should notice?" And I would always tell them, "Notice the character of the opposition." And they would say, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And I said, "I'm not telling you what to report. You report what you see about the opposition, about the people who are standing on the sidewalks beside us screaming obscenities, and some of them openly engaging in satanic rituals and so forth." It was a spectacular scene, which you would think would make great drama, great reporting, but nobody reported on it. So that was perhaps the most frustrating thing. I guess another frustrating thing was when I was asked to comment on someone on the pro-abortion side who had reported a death threat. And I said, well, I think that's a terrible thing, and I can sympathize because I've had death threats too. And the reporter showed no interest whatsoever in that. There was just an enormous double standard. And that continues to this day, by the way, because, to this day, we have arguments in Massachusetts about how the abortion clinics need protection because of all the violence that takes place outside them. Well, if you go to these clinics, you'll see that they're all rigged up with video machinery that it's taping everything that takes place on the sidewalk. So if there's any level of violence, why aren't we seeing any of the videotape?
Yeah, I don't think that those kinds of claims are surprising to anybody who knows anything about the pro-life movement, that's the characterization of it by the media.
Sure.
Now, you mentioned the Archdiocese wanting to figure out how to control this group. And, I can understand that's something that commonly happens with the church bureaucracy throughout Catholic history, is whenever there's sort of a grassroots kind of movement, whether it's spiritual or, anything else, sometimes it makes even well-meaning people nervous because they don't know where it's going to go. Maybe they're a little bit too concerned about how it looks. But what was your experience of interacting with the Archdiocese of Boston at that time as regards Operation Rescue?
It was pretty positive, to be fair. Most of the people in the Archdiocese were favorably disposed. They were worried, maybe, about public perception, and I think unduly so, but most of them were favorably disposed. When I never asked anybody for permission to be involved myself. I thought it was one of those things where I would be doing the Archdiocese a favor by giving everybody a level of, plausible deniability. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, if I were arrested, which eventually I was, that they could say and be perfectly honest in saying, Phil didn't tell us he was going to do this. Uh-huh. So they were not officially approving it.
I see.
And they didn't officially approve it. Unofficially, they were friendly to me. Nobody condemned me for it. There are a few people who, the sort of people within the Archdiocese who you would expect to be unhappy with me, who probably were unhappy with me anyway.
Right.
Were unhappy about this, but by and large, I remember one Monsignor, currently a bishop, who said, when he found out, he said, "Oh, good for you." And
nice.
That wasn't an atypical reaction.
Good. So how was it that you were attacked in the media?
I don't know that I personally was attacked I was attacked only insofar as I represented Operation Rescue,
I see.
and there were fairly routine attacks that Operation Rescue was engaged in violence.
Right. And now, was this sort of insinuation, or were there more outright
I think
accusations of that?
There were vague accusations. The implication was clear, but it was fairly unusual that someone would come out and say Operation Rescue is violent.
Right.
I'll give you one spectacular case in point where that did happen, and that's where the late Senator Ted Kennedy, during a campaign fundraising event, said, and I quote, "Operation Rescue has a policy of firebombing and even murder."
Wow. That is remarkable.
I was actually among several people who sued.
Wow.
Because that, accusing someone of murder is
a policy.
A policy.
Firebombing.
Yes.
Wow, that is nuts. Okay, so you ended up writing a book it was published in 1992, I believe, titled Operation Rescue: A Challenge to the Nation's Conscience. And I read it. It was a really fascinating book. I had sort of heard of Operation Rescue before, but didn't know the details, and certainly not the numbers of people and the scale of it at its height. But your book was published when it was still somewhat in its heyday. You anticipated that it might fizzle out for various reasons, not entirely, but in terms of the mass movement. But all the same, as I was reading the book, I was struck by the level of optimism, if that's the right word, and it might not be, by the participants, so many of whom were quoted as saying, like, abortion is going to be over in America within our generation and things like this. And it was kind of surreal reading that, given that today it's kind of like something that we almost just we're against it, but it's just become the status quo. And I don't see people saying things like that and having that level of optimism for the near future now. So what are your thoughts looking back on that time?
Well, several different thoughts. For one thing, it's not just Operation Rescue. There was a lot more optimism generally at that time about the political possibility of overturning Roe v. Wade or somehow reversing the acceptance of abortion. As far as Operation Rescue's involvement, you also have to keep in mind that there were times at the peak where really the number of people who were participating in rescues was increasing week by week. And I'm terrible about dates. Would that have been 1989 or so? When we were at our peak in Boston, the first time I was arrested, there was something like 240 of us arrested in the same day. You're getting near the upper limit of what the police can handle there. And if it continues to increase, if the Knights of Columbus decide to come out in force on the sidewalks, if that becomes as viral as we know, that's a word we didn't use then either. Then it's a phenomenon that the government can't control. So that was a real possibility as well. And I have to say, to this day, I still think that Operation Rescue represents a huge spiritual investment that is bound to pay off one way or another. There are just too many people who sacrificed too much. In the divine economy, those things aren't fun.
The blood of the martyrs being the seed of the church and that sort of thing.
A little like that.
Yeah. If you were going to write a book about Operation Rescue today, or to update the book that you wrote then, obviously there's been developments since then, but more broadly, as opposed to just specific factual updates, what would you change or add to it?
I suppose one thing that was in the book, but I'd certainly accentuate it much more, was I would drive home the message that this was by far the largest movement of civil disobedience in American history. Yeah. It dwarfed the civil rights movement, and it's really an enormous omission from American history that people of the rising generations just don't hear about it at all. It was a very important civil movement, and I think I would emphasize that. I'd also probably emphasize, looking back, that the way it was beaten was simply by imposing draconian penalties on people who blocked abortion clinics. And these are penalties that are not inflicted on people who do similar things. For instance, the people who disrupt vivisection, or, the Friends of the Earth who put spikes through trees to stop loggers, which, by the way, is potentially deadly. And so that, Bill Connor told me the story once about how he had a bunch of people who were unable to demonstrate outside an abortion clinic, and they were told to go next door to where they were demonstrating on the sidewalk outside a shop that sold musical instruments. And the fellow who owned that shop complained because they were interfering with his business. But you see, his business selling musical instruments is not protected. Only abortionists are protected by law.
Right.
Crazy.
Although I wonder if enough people started protesting logging to where it really became a hindrance to the industry, if the hammer wouldn't come down at that point, given all the moneyed interest involved. But still, it is remarkable to see, a 2.5-year prison sentence in the case of Bill Cotter, and the sorts of massive crippling fines that were clearly intended to send a political message that judges would impose and things like that.
Exactly. There's just a level of protection that you don't see for, say, grocery stores.
Why do you think so few Catholics know about Operation Rescue? I mean, those who weren't around at the time.
Good question, because nobody's told them. I think that to the general public, there's still that air of extremism. And I think that the opposition was fairly successful in painting us as extremists. And because so few people had an opportunity to meet with the people involved or hear about them, hear them in action, hear them speaking, that the accusations stuck much more than they should have.
When I was reading the book, one question that I had, and this is obviously easier said than done, is at the point when they would be imposing these draconian prison sentences, if people in the movement had just called the bluff, there's no way they could have imprisoned that number of people for long periods of time. I mean, wouldn't the whole thing have just sort of come crumbling down if the bluff there had been called? Not that it was a bluff exactly, but you know what I mean.
That's a good question. I can just tell you personally that I was not willing at that point in my life to risk 2 years in jail for what was really symbolic. I mean, it was and it wasn't symbolic. I wasn't there trying simply to send a message. It wasn't just a political demonstration. We were trying to save babies. But as things developed, we realized, we'll be carted off to jail, and then the abortions will continue. So it's question how many we're saving. And to give up 2 years of your life and, as a father to young children,
right,
I just wasn't willing to do it.
Right. Yeah, that's quite understandable. Is there anything else you'd like to add that I haven't asked about, as far as, especially to people who may be learning about this for the first time in this episode?
Well, I mean, of course, I'd love to plug my own book. It's heaven knows we could use the sales. But I would just encourage people to learn a little bit. If you delve into it, any halfway objective account of Operation Rescue, I think you're going to find it an eye-opener, because there was much more going on than people typically realize today, and much closer to the mainstream than people might lead you to believe. Because, as I say, there were thousands and thousands of people out there, and it wasn't just the people who were arrested; it was also the prayer supporters who were surrounding us. And it was a movement that came very close to the tipping point, I think. To the point where the abortion regime could not have been sustained.
So I'll definitely be linking to your book on our show notes page, which will be at catholicculture.org/episode 2. That's the number 2, not spelled out. And aside from your book, if people really wanted to delve in, is there anything else you would recommend reading? Should they go read Joan Andrews or what?
They should go read about Joan Andrews. There is an amazing story. That woman was really an inspiration to so many people. And read about the Red Rose rescues that are taking place right now. There's a very small number of people who are taking great risks, and they're upholding this tradition. And as I say, it's happening right now. It's another dramatic story.
Actually, I just realized I didn't really talk about Joan Andrews too much in the Bill Cotter interview because we were mainly focusing on his experience. Could you just give like a really quick summary introduction of who she was for our
She was
audience?
one of the inspirational leaders early on in Operation Rescue. And I'm terrible with dates and figures, but she spent months and months and months in jail, including many, many weeks in solitary confinement. Going from jail to jail, being released from one to face charges in another, and did it all with a really saintly approach of willing self-sacrifice. I remember she met with Cardinal Law while I was in Boston, and the Cardinal came out and said that Joan Andrews reminded him of Dorothy Day, the same sort of radical commitment.
Okay, well, I think we've basically covered it. Thanks a lot for your time,
Okay.
Phil.
Glad that was fun to do, actually.
All right, there's some essential Catholic history for you. Are we really going to shy away from it because we want Ted Kennedy to like us? Guys, Ted Kennedy is dead. He's been exposed as a weasel at this point. You shouldn't care about what Ted Kennedy thinks. If we got any bishops listening to this podcast, please stop caring what the Ted Kennedys of this world think. If any bishop insults Ted Kennedy publicly and gives a shout out to the Catholic Culture Podcast, I'm going to send you a t-shirt. Sorry, it's after 4 a.m. again. I really need to get someone else to edit these things. But seriously, if there are any bishops listening to this, it doesn't have to be Ted. It could be any Kennedy. It'd be awesome. Please do it. Seriously, though, if these churchmen who are still trying to hobnob with the elite, I wish they would just realize how incredibly punk rock it is at this moment in time to be a Catholic who doesn't mince words and is unapologetic. The Catholics on the ground are not impressed that you got invited to the big gala or whatever. Step up, dude. Don't be the meme. Be the memester. All right, I got that out of my system. Now it is time for our excerpt of the week. This is from Benedict XVI's encyclical Deus Caritas Est. Love, caritas, will always prove necessary, even in the most just society. There is no ordering of the state so just that it can eliminate the need for a service of love. Whoever wants to eliminate love is preparing to eliminate man as such. There will always be suffering which cries out for consolation and help. There will always be loneliness. There will always be situations of material need where help in the form of concrete love of neighbor is indispensable. The state which would provide everything, absorbing everything into itself, would ultimately become a mere bureaucracy incapable of guaranteeing the very thing which the suffering person, every person, needs, namely, loving personal concern. Okay, that's it for this episode of the Catholic Culture Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode or find it educational, please share it with your friends and family. I would really love for more people to hear the story of Operation Rescue. I think it's a very important part of our history, and to know about Bill Cotter and the sacrifice he made for the pro-life movement. And next week, it's going to be an interview with journalist Peter Jesserer Smith on the importance of the Native American Catholic legacy to the new evangelization. Until then, just remember, in the words of Czesław Miłosz, a true opium for the people is a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged. Uh-oh. Have a great week!